name is Jamel Gaston, and I am a senior studying construction management, and I'm the president of Out at LT with Friends, the campus lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and LGBT ally student group on campus. Firstly, I would like to thank you for coming out not only to this event, but any event you've been able to attend during Pride Week. This week at Lawrence Tech is Out at LT's third annual Pride Week celebration. Pride Week was developed as a way to honor the LGBT community of our campus, educate the campus community, build stronger connections between members of the community and allies, and celebrate the achievements of our organization and LGBT people as a whole. I would like to honor my peers who helped make this week a success. I would like to also thank our advisors, Dr. Scott Schneider and graduate assistant, Krista Foster. If you are a member of Out at LT with Friends, could you please stand up? I would also like to acknowledge other distinguished guests here tonight. Firstly, I would like to thank that tonight we have with us our provost, Dr. Maria Vaz, who will speak later in the program. Also, I would like to acknowledge Dean of Students Kevin Finn for being with us tonight. The administration has played a vital role in our continued successes, and we are very thankful for all their support. Now, I would like to bring out Krista Foster, a LTU alumna and current graduate assistant in the Office of Student Engagement. As an undergraduate, Krista was an active supporter of Out at LTU with Friends, and now helps us out even more as one of our advisors. Krista will help me present the first ever Ally Awards. We decided as a group that we needed to honor those allies on campus who have helped not only our group, but the LGBT community. We have created 3 award categories: Student Ally of the Year, Staff Ally of the Year, and Outstanding Member of the Year.
Our recipient of the 2012 Student Ally of the Year Award is Megan Ziegler. Unfortunately, Megan cannot be with us tonight. She's driving to Florida, poor her. But she received her award on Monday at the Coming Out monologues and the premiere of LTU's It Gets Better video. Megan is a recent graduate with a Bachelor's of Science in Media Communication, and she devoted many hours of her time to filming, directing, and editing Lawrence Tech's It Gets Better project video, which we premiered this past Monday. The It Gets Better project was created as a response to bullying against LGBT people, which celebrities, universities, companies, and numerous other groups have participated in. Megan, thank you for your hard work and dedication to the LGBT community.
Our recipient of the Staff Ally of the Year Award is Laura Affer. Laura works as an international student advisor in the Office of International Programs. For lack of a better term, Laura has been a behind-the-scenes ally for Out at LT with Friends. Laura helped in the development of the current version of Project SAFE, which is LTU's LGBT ally training program. Laura also played a very prominent role in the It Gets Better video and greatly helped with Pride Week, particularly ensuring the success of the Coming Out monologues. Please join me in congratulating Laura Affer for her outstanding dedication and support. Would you like to say anything?
I just wanted to say thank you very much to Out at Friends with LTU for this award, and it's a huge honor. Some of my personal friends and family asked me why this was an important thing to me in general, the LGBT issues, and it just seems like the most basic, common thing of fairness. I am a big supporter of any social justice cause, and it's not fair the way that the LGBT community gets sidelined and ostracized and left out of so many things. I was talking to Jamil earlier today, you were wearing a shirt, and I was like, what about those shirts? It's the most basic principle of the issue. Love is love. The world needs more love. There's no reason whatsoever to leave a group out just because of what some people think is right and wrong. So I'm very proud of the group of students that are out at LTU with Friends these days, because really it was the students that brought this group up, that made it what it is today. You guys fought for what you needed, you got a group together, you formed it, and now you are an important and vital member of this campus. So I'm very proud of you guys and honored for this award. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Our recipient of the Outstanding Member of the Year is Michael Newman. Michael is a computer science major here at Lawrence Tech and has been a member of OUT since he first started here at Lawrence Tech. Michael was instrumental in the redevelopment of the executive leadership in the organization. Currently, Michael holds a position on the executive board as our scribe, managing our communication and our finances. Like our other recipients, Mike was also involved with the It Gets Better project. Please join me in congratulating Michael Newman for his ambition and support.
This is a great honor to me. I wanted to thank everybody that nominated me, and thank everybody here. I wanted to thank everybody here for supporting us. Jamel, our president, and Ian, vice president, Krista, and Dr. Scott. They've been awesome helping us with Pride Week and just getting the organization together. OUT has been very special to me. I've always wanted to do everything I can to support OUT and support the members. And I can't explain the feeling that I have being recognized by all of you. Words can't explain like the feeling, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. We would also like to acknowledge all of our allies on campus, especially those who participated in the Pride Week Safe training. Please give all of our campus allies a round of applause. Thank you again for everything you've done for our organization and the LGBT community as a whole. I would now like to bring Dr. Maria Vaz, our provost, on stage to make some remarks and introduce our keynote speaker, Nathan Phelps.
Thank you very much. Good evening. As probably all of you know, this is Pride Week at Lawrence Tech, and it's a very important week for us because we value and we believe in the dignity of every single human being. We value diversity among our community, and we value inclusion, and we believe in accepting every single one of the members of our community. I want to thank, starting by thanking out at LTU in the engagement office, because for all the organization of what they have for this week. And in particular, I would like to thank out at LTU because of the important role that they have here. The first one is really a role of education. They educate all our community in terms of the situations and of bullying, the struggles and the challenges that lesbians, gays, bisexual, and transgender go through, and it's important that we understand it. And second, because they really are a support group for all the students that come out to LTU and Lawrence Tech, and in particular the students that are in the LGBT group. So they have a very important role. They are a group that is relatively new. I remember, I think probably they are 2 years ago that they were founded. I can't see anything, so I'm looking to, I'm sorry, but I just see lights coming to me. So I think it was 3 years? Okay. And so although they have been only 3 years old, they have been a very important group from the beginning, and so I want to thank them again for the important role that they play here at Lawrence Tech and as part of our community and our family. So now I'm going to have the honor to introduce the keynote speaker today. And as you know, is Nate Phelps. Nate Phelps is the son of Reverend Fred Phelps, that is the pastor of Westboro Baptist Church. And as you probably know, Reverend Fred Phelps is well known for organizing his demonstrations and funerals of soldiers because he believes, and the people that follow him believe, that the reason why we are at war and that people die and our soldiers die is because we are too tolerant to lesbians, gays, and bisexuals and transgender. So his sonmate left home at midnight of his 18th birthday, and he started a new life in California, and then he moved to Canada. He's going to tell us his story, and most important, he's also going to tell us about the dangers of fanatism and religious fanatism, and about child abuse. So you know, his story is a story for all of us to learn from, but it's also a story of hope. So please help me to welcome Nate Phelps.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I certainly appreciate having the opportunity to be here tonight. Can't see anybody out there. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and the Revelation. At the age of 7, I could recite the names of all 66 books of the Bible in about 19 seconds. It was required of us because my father got tired of waiting as his children flipped through the Bible looking for the verses he was preaching from. Afterwards, if one of us took too long to find the passage, my father would pause in the middle of his preaching, cast a gimlet eye on the offending child, and demand that somebody smack that kid. In 1991, over a generation ago, my father led his small church to stage a protest against gays at a park in Topeka, Kansas. Nearly the entire membership of the church consisted of 9 of my 12 siblings and members of their immediate family. The community responded with outrage at the mean-spirited and hateful nature of the protest, as my family declared the entire world doomed for embracing the idea of equality for gays. Today, this tiny church of approximately 50 people, led by my father, is known not just throughout America, but across the world. Their campaign has expanded to picketing funerals of soldiers and victims of high-profile disasters from 9/11 to Hurricane Katrina to the recent shooting in Aurora, Colorado. When Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, passed away, they announced their intention to picket his funeral because he had a platform to preach the gospel and didn't use it. Interestingly enough, they used their iPhones to spread the news. One other side note, the KKK recently added a disclaimer to one of their websites denying any involvement with or support for the Westboro Baptist Church. More radical than the KKK. Not bad. Most people coming in contact with my family for the first time generally just stare in stunned amazement. But for me, it's a natural and almost inevitable progression from the things that I was taught and experienced growing up there. My father's theological message was fed to us from infancy. Verses were written on a blackboard in the dining room, and we were expected to memorize them. Books and records teaching the violent stories of the Old Testament were prolific. and there was the painted sign with one corner broken off that sat in the vestibule of our church for years. On it was painted a verse from Hebrews declaring, "It is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment." The inherent danger in these messages first surfaced for me when I was around 8 years old. I recall sitting in a church pew, my father's voice droning in the background with yet another sermon about suffering for eternity in a lake of fire where the worm that eats on you never dies. With an emerging obsessiveness, I'm determined to grasp this concept of eternity. As my mind struggled with the sheer enormity and impossibility of such an idea, a feeling of dread seeped into my chest, and I burst into tears. I didn't know it then, but the walls of fear, hate, and distrust around my heart were already under construction. My father's a self-styled primitive Baptist, largely adhering to the teachings of John Calvin. Woven throughout and defining this system is the doctrine of absolute predestination. Absolute predestination posits that in the council halls of eternity past, an all-knowing, all-powerful Creator preordained who would be saved and who would be damned. Mankind would have no say in this since they're dead in their trespasses and sins. If you're selected, you gain eternal life. If you lose, you suffer the most extreme physical and mental anguish forever. Over the years, my father has refined Calvin's doctrine to the point that he's concluded that all of us are going to hell. Only he and his followers have been chosen by God in this end time. This doctrine, as it's understood and practiced by them, is very important to understand the Westboro Baptist Church. Salvation is a gift. You have no effect on your own salvation, so there's no real way of knowing if you have it. We heard terms like an impression on the heart, a calling, or an unction. These very subjective terms were the best way one could identify whether God had found favor with them. So it logically follows that my father and that church are not carrying these signs and preaching to try to convince people of their truth. Unlike mainstream Christianity that sees proselytizing as a part of the faith, my father has no intention of converting anyone. That job belongs to God. One of his favorite phrases behind the pulpit was, "If God don't want you, we don't want you." Either God chooses you or you go to hell. And if he chooses you, somehow you miraculously end up at the Westboro Baptist Church. To illustrate this point, in the mid-90s, my father was a guest on a Christian radio talk show in Southern California. The host of the show was a popular Christian apologist named Rich Bueller. Bueller suggested that my father's failure to bear fruit from his evangelizing might point to some error in his theology. With typical aggression, Fred barked back at him, "That's not the test. The test is fidelity in preaching." In other words, his only duty was to put the message out there. The rest was up to God. When Bueller pressed him, pointing out the New Testament passage that says, "You will know them by their fruit," my father uttered that most profound, debate-ending theological imperative that is the cornerstone of their campaign. "Well, Rich, you're just wrong." We were taught that the only true Bible was the King James Bible. This was the one true and correct version of God's Word. I always puzzled over the fuss that he made about this, apparently irrelevant issue until I was older, and realized that his theology was so intricately and tortuously tied to the sequence of words in the Bible that if he allowed any other version, it would be too easily unraveled. And that was the one absolutely divinely inspired truth that he alone had discovered. From this Bible, we were taught a variety of doctrines and behaviors that were rigorously upheld. On the few occasions that I recall someone challenging his version, he was viciously decisive in quelling the rebellion with threats of human and divine violence. Some things we learned. Every thought and deed in our lives were laced with moral implications. Every decision was a decision for or against the will of God. We were not to be of this world, but separate from it. Look at what the world does and assume it's evil. Find the evidence for that in the Bible and strive to behave differently. When our teachers led the classroom in Christmas carols, we were to leave the room and go to the library. We had to perform better than anyone else, not for any sense of personal pride or accomplishment, but to prove that we were different, that we were God's chosen ones. Childhood indiscretions took on profound implications that reverberated down the halls of eternity. When we misbehaved, our Father would rage for hours that we were sons of Belial, workers of iniquity, pawns of Satan, sinning against the Most High God. As a result, as we grew, we would do or say anything to hide our mistakes and shortcomings. The natural process of growth through error was stymied in our earliest years. We learned that our hearts were deceitful and desperately wicked, that we were inherently evil with no good in us, and only God's work in our heart made us marginally acceptable in His eyes and in our Father's eyes. Our education about the world was profoundly colored by this fundamental message. One of my earliest doubts about his belief system rose from this question: if in fact the Adamic race is so thoroughly cursed with the moral corruption, how is it that we so willingly turn to the writings of these same corrupt men to find salvation? My father's answer to that question is that these corrupt men were guided by the Spirit of God as they penned their work. The problem with that answer is that it appears within the very writing that's in question. It's sort of a divine believe it because I told you to answer. From behind the pulpit, our father raged against every other belief system and world leader. Strong men were built and destroyed Sunday after Sunday, as he taught us that since God hated them, we must hate them. That if their ideas contradicted his ideas, which were God's ideas, then those ideas had to be satanic ideas. So they were evil, and their thinking was evil. One insidious consequence of this practice was to ingrain in our minds that the very tools of discernment that we're born with are evil. We learn not to trust the process of reasoning, as it would raise ideas that contradicted the one truth from God. If a reasonable idea surfaced, if it was contrary to the ideas we were taught, our instinct was to challenge it, fear it, and reject it. For years, this was a profound barrier for me. As I tried to evolve and define the world as I saw it, I continually rejected or minimized fundamentally sound ideas for fear that they were spiritually evil. But there was another aspect of growing up within the walls of Westboro. Any violation of Fred's rules put you at risk of being beaten and ultimately ostracized. As children, it was pretty much an idle threat because we really had no way of comprehending the reality of being ostracized. The words were spoken. We understood that we would be kicked out. But every day we woke up and we were home, so the idea really didn't have claws. But living it day in and day out, year in and year out, it leaves you feeling vulnerable and disconnected. Once you've learned that you can no longer rely on your family for shelter and support, you foster an obsession about what was wrong with you, that you couldn't be loved. What horrible decision have you made that separates you from all you've ever known? How can an idea in your head cause your family to hate you? It's an incredibly strong tool to maintain power and control. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of it is this. After 18 years of ritualistic teaching, it's hammered into every fiber of your being that God is waiting at the gate to smite those who would stray. So you wander through life wondering why God chose you for this particular fate. When will He strike? How much will you suffer? And that's just the beginning, since eternity awaits when you die. I mentioned a moment ago the risk of being beaten. Violence was a fact of life in our home. As I reached the age of awareness, my father had made the decision to return to law school for his degree. Faced with the responsibility of a wife and 13 children, as well as the demands of school, he was soon addicted to prescription amphetamines and then barbiturates to help him sleep at night. The combination of stress and this chemical cocktail made his temper quick, violent, and indiscriminate. Despite these circumstances, he eventually earned his law degree, but it wasn't long before he was suspended for 2 years for an ethics violation. I want to note here that his explanation for that suspension was that the powers of darkness were constantly attacking the church. This was always his default explanation whenever the world held him to account for his actions. But I want to go another direction with this. I imagine that many of you have seen images of my family's protests. In the midst of each of these events, you'll see a handful of children, my nieces and nephews, carrying signs. Whenever I see them, I'm reminded of some of the events that transpired after my father was suspended from law. Without an income, he quickly hit upon the idea of sending the children out to sell candy. Ostensibly, we were selling candy to buy a new piano and organ for the church. But after several years of this explanation, people started wondering why we hadn't bought the instruments yet. By then, we'd become so well known on the streets of Topeka that sales began to wane. So we moved our operations out to surrounding communities, traveling from Wichita, Omaha, Kansas City, to Oklahoma. Our evenings and weekends were busy pushing chocolates for Jesus. An interesting part of the story is that we learned early on how free people were with their money after they'd had a few drinks. So Friday and Saturday nights would find us at the tender age of 9 to 15, peddling our wares in bars while strippers performed just a few feet away. Now don't misunderstand me. It's not that I'm complaining about the view, but it did undermine my father's message that we were special and that we were to be in the world but not of the world. Whenever someone raised a very legitimate concern that such places were unsafe for small children, Fred would bristle and after attacking and insulting the person would assure them and us that God was watching over his sheep. And then on the first anniversary of his suspension, I returned home from school to find my mother weeping in the church vestibule. She was sitting in a chair crying, an old stocking cap shoved on her head, while my older brother Mark, a child himself, is standing with her, trying to console her by rubbing her back. She looks up and sees me standing in the doorway, turns to her older son, and her eyes flashed with anger. She reached up and yanked the stocking cap off her head. Mark and I recoiled from the sight. Her long black hair was gone, chopped so short that there are areas where her stark white scalp showed through. While I stared in silence, my mind immediately went to something far more sinister. You see, my father made much of the rituals that he unearthed in the Bible. He believed that our search for and adherence to the nuanced commandments of the Bible were the critical proof that we were God's chosen ones. One of the areas of the good book that he drew guidance from was in 1 Corinthians, where Paul addresses the hierarchy of authority from God to Christ to man to woman. A sign of a woman's submission, he argues, is her wearing her hair long. But Fred had decided that the word long was actually to be translated as uncut. So no woman was allowed to put scissors to her hair. Her salvation literally depended on it. So when I saw my mother with her hair cut off, I felt dread for her eternal soul. Women were second-class citizens in our church and family. My father proclaimed this adamantly, with no room for compromise. The Bible was very clear on the subject. Eve had been deceived by a talking snake, so logically she was the weaker vessel in all respects. Then Paul bolsters this misogynistic attitude in a variety of his letters to the early churches. Wives were to be in subjection to their husbands. So Fred extrapolated from that his right to bring her back into subjection if he perceived that she had strayed. Yet when he turned his instructive fist on my mother, I instinctively felt internal conflict. For me, it was intuitively wrong that a 6'2", 250-pound man be allowed to beat up a woman barely half his size. How could the creator of the universe justify that? But his so-called discipline didn't end with our mother. My father was a strong believer in spare the rod, spoil the child. Dissatisfied with the fraying barber strap that he had used for years, he decided to upgrade. Presumably, the larger the rod, the less spoiled the child. So he announced one day that he would be using a mattock handle in the future. Now, a mattock is a tool used to remove stubborn roots from the ground. The handle is about 4.5 feet long, solid wood with a circumference of about 15 inches. When Fred would beat a child, he would swing the handle like a baseball bat, striking anywhere from the lower back to the backside of the knees. Generally, his beatings included an hour or so of verbal abuse as well. So he would beat the child for a while, then curse them, and condemn them in God's name for a while before returning to the beating. The initial blows would cause the skin to swell and stretch tight. The second round of blows would split the skin, and a watery, bloody fluid would bleed out. Oftentimes, when the mattock wasn't readily at hand, he would use his fists, feet, and knees. Sometimes he would grab the child by the wrists, lift him in the air toward him, bringing his knees up and into their stomach. He discovered early on that this had a remarkable capacity to restore order. All these things and many more were going on throughout my childhood as he presented his version of the gospel to the small group of people who met every Sunday at the Westboro Baptist Church. His theology was not popular, so throughout my childhood, we never had more than 3 families in attendance at any time. As I grew, my doubts grew with me. As my doubts grew, my defiance grew. As defiance grew, the violence I experienced grew. In spite of his words, in spite of his uncanny ability to weave arguments and justifications from the words of the Bible, I couldn't reconcile what I heard him say and what I saw him do to others. How was it possible that the best God had to offer the world was his raging and hateful ideology? But even as I wrestled with the faith of my father, there was a large part of me that had accepted his pronouncements of who I was as a person. This is something that each and every one of us does in our childhood. Our parents are a mirror reflecting back to us our nature. It's in the formative years that our understanding of the nature of the world and ourselves is hardwired into us. I'd like to shift gears here for a minute because I think it's important to make this point here. The vast majority of people who've heard my family's message of condemnation and divine hatred respond with some form of, well, that's not my God. My God is a loving God, a caring God, a forgiving God, etc. While each of us is entitled to hold whatever beliefs we wish, there are facts and realities that may conflict with them. One fact that can't be disputed is that the beliefs held by the Westboro Baptist Church are well grounded in the words of the Bible. This book that is generally interpreted as the words of the benevolent God contains all the passages necessary to come to the conclusions that my father arrived at. It isn't, as most who encounter them would argue, that they've interpreted the Bible wrong. It is that the Bible provides ample opportunity for the construction of their theology. In fact, their version of Christianity was the mainstream version only 200 years ago. Proof of that can be found in a sermon that was referenced often by preachers of that day. The sermon by American theologian Jonathan Edwards was entitled, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." The essence of that sermon can be summed up in this sentence from it. There is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. My father taught us that God doesn't change. He has always been as he is. For this reason, my father abhorred any evidence of change in the message of the Bible that he saw. As he watched Christianity evolve to meet the ideology of modern society, he perceived it as a degradation of the truth. So adhering to the letter of the truth as he saw it was of utmost importance. when he ran into thorny issues like the fact that the King James Bible was just one of many in a long stream of interpretations or translations. He had to construct some justification with just one of them being the real Word of God. When confronted with a radically changing message of Christianity from antiquity, he was forced to pick a particular time when the real truth was made known to man. He arbitrarily picked Calvin's version as the immutable truth of God. I doubt there's anyone here who really believes that the message of Christianity has remained unchanged for 2,000 years. For all the reasons I've outlined so far, and so many more that I don't have time to cover, I made the decision to run away from home when I was about 16. But I couldn't do it until I was 18, so I plotted. I secretly bought an old car for $300 and hid it. I slowly packed my meager belongings and stashed them in the garage. And on the night of my 18th birthday, I waited until everyone was asleep. Then I backed the car into the driveway, packed the trunk, slipped back into the house, and waited. I stood in the dining room of the home I grew up in for 18 years. From my vantage point at the bottom of the stairs leading to my father's bedroom, I could watch the clock on the wall to the left and see the pulpit that he preached from through the door to my right. I could hear his voice booming out to the tiny congregation as he meticulously and exhaustively defined the system of faith that justified his abuse. I recalled him expounding on the verses that proved his enemies are the enemies of God. And I remember him violently reinforcing the demands that his children contend for the faith with the same fierceness that he exhibited. We grew up in an incubator of hate. I turned back to the clock, and I watched it slowly rise to midnight, and then I left. Now, those who knew the truth of our childhood wondered how I was so normal, as they put it. At first, I thought they exaggerated. I was fine. I was away from the violence, and life would be good. If I occasionally disappeared from life, lost in a silent rage that lasted for hours, that was just who I was. No big deal. If I refused to go near a church or consider religion, wasn't that normal? I had my fill already. It didn't really say anything to me about my mental state. In 1981, I moved to Southern California. It didn't really mean anything that I felt abject fear to have, or abject relief to have 1,700 miles separating me from my father. Then I met Tammy. We dated for 4 years, and I became a father to her 3-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. If I worried about Tammy's insistence that her little girl not be spanked, wasn't that just common sense? Every time I thought of marriage, the darkness that threatened to consume me because of her previous marriage, that was normal, wasn't it? And my utter inability to understand the concept of love as I struggled with that question, don't we all wonder about that? I managed to push these very normal anxieties to the back of my mind, and I finally asked her to marry me. When we got pregnant a month after the wedding, I didn't dare tell anyone that I was terrified. I knew that children were a gift from God, and was sure that I had lost favor with him when I left my father's home, so he wouldn't allow this gift to be bestowed upon me. How did I explain that to my wife? So I lived in silent fear for the next 7 months, sure that this would end in disaster. When my little boy was born, it was the closest thing to a miracle that I had ever experienced in my life. As I sat and stared at this little human, my heart swelled with an emotion I had never felt. 18 months later, we had twins, and things began to unravel soon after. The damage I thought I had avoided, the obstacles that I naively assumed weren't there, began to surface with a vengeance. My world shifted as I took on the labor of love of raising these 3 beautiful creatures. I was determined that they would know love and inclusion, that they would never doubt for a moment the unconditional acceptance of their father. the same time, I began to ask questions without answers. How could a person feel this way toward another human and ever treat them the way our Father treated us? And the inevitable question eventually came. What was wrong with me? I found a counselor with a theology and psychology degree, and we worked together for a year as I began to unravel the hypocrisy of my father's religion. I joined the local evangelical free church to make sure that my children were a part of the community and felt like they belonged. I listened to the message of the kinder, gentler God of mainstream Christianity, and I prayed. I prayed night and day for a sign that this God was there and that he cared. His silence took me deeper into the theology. I became an outspoken apologist for Christianity by day, but at night I worried and fretted. Sleepless, anxious hours passed as I played violent confrontations with my father over and over in my mind. In these battles, I would test new ideas and beliefs against his rhetoric and doctrine. As I mentioned, each time I would grab a hold of an idea contrary to my father's, I would find myself struggling with the fear that even to entertain such ideas was evidence of Satan's influence in my life. What it really boiled down to is that I was unable to make the transition from living my father's ideas as a child to embracing my own understanding of the world as an adult. The system we grew up in did not foster individuality, but rather conformity. The individual was lost to the collective. My depression deepened and I went back into counseling. This time I was diagnosed with PTSD and I checked into a mental health facility. My entire adult life I had continued to subjugate my own thoughts and ideas to those hardwired into my brain. I had failed to look at them for what they were, just ideas. Just ideas that were subject to the same rules of proof as all ideas. But I hadn't learned that lesson yet. I left the hospital 2 weeks later with the understanding that nothing could cure what I had except trying to ignore it. My delusions were still intact. So I went back to the church and Bible study. Over the next 10 years, a handful of events conspired to force me away from my fear of reason, and I began to challenge my father's ideas more overtly. As America plunged into the first Gulf War, my personal reaction was colored with a deep fear of this pervasive notion of Armageddon. As Hussein impotently lobbed Scud missiles into Israel, images of nuclear holocaust in the Middle East haunted me. Then at Christmas time in 1994, I stopped at a Pizza Hut on the way home with my 3 young children. We were sitting in the car listening to Christmas songs while we waited for our dinner. Suddenly my oldest boy, Tyler, asked me a question about Jesus, and I decided I would explain the gospel to them once and for all. Intensely aware of the fear that it evoked in me as a child, I tried to present it in a positive way. Explaining the beauty of heaven, Tyler suddenly interrupted, asking about the people who didn't believe. Bless his little atheist heart. Well, I blundered in explaining that the Bible says they go to a place called hell. How long, his mind wondered. The Bible says eternity, I answered. How long is that, he asked. Forever, I said. He burst into tears, and as I gathered him into my arms, I recall crying in a church pew myself as I listened to my father preach about hell and eternity. So I stopped taking my kids to church. I started teaching them to think critically. I challenged them constantly over the ideas they brought home from school. I taught them to be skeptical, and I taught them to challenge authority. And in the midst of this process, a still small voice kept reminding me, "Physician, heal thyself." I began to challenge the leaders of my church, and they had no answers. I took my questions to higher authorities, and their responses were no better. I even wrote to national Christian leaders for greater understanding, and their rhetoric came back empty. Then September 11th happened. America was shook to its foundations. Like all of us, I struggled with the powerful emotions elicited by this act. I watched as the country responded, and I had an epiphany. We collectively condemned an act of blind faith, then turned to blind faith for answers. In 2004, for the first time in my life, I picked up a book that wasn't written by a Christian. Michael Shermer's The Science of Good and Evil changed everything for me. As I pored over his words, hope stirred in my heart. Here was someone who posited the reality I had secretly imagined for years, but dared not give voice to. Here was the justification for so many ideas that I held secretly in my heart. Ideas. We live in a world of ideas. We define our reality with ideas. We give credibility to ideas by calling them facts, or capital T, truth. But they're just ideas until they're vetted by reality and withstand the test of evidence. They're just ideas until they can be proven true through experimentation and rigorous research. With this newfound understanding and confidence that the machinations of my mind could have validity, I began to challenge the ideas hardwired in my brain. What gave my father's Bible validity as the inspired word of a creator? What gave my father's interpretation of that Bible validity? Where was the evidence? Lacking evidence, what gave the specific claims that he had pounded into our youthful minds legitimacy? What proof did I have that physical abuse was necessary to raise a child properly? What proof was there that women were inherently inferior? And what proof could I claim to that a certain group of people should be shunned and treated unequally because they love someone of the same gender? The changes came slowly and then suddenly. Once the fear subsided and confidence came, the belief system that I had brought with me from my youth collapsed. Ideas are fed to us from the time we're born. As children, we're unable to discern the difference between fact and fiction. If the idea comes from authority, it's real. If we hear from our parents and our pastors and our teachers and our neighbors that being gay is wrong, we simply know that being gay is wrong. And if this message is given to us at the right age, up to around 7 or 8, it becomes part of the hardware of our brains. As we grow, we develop the ability to discern between truth and fiction. If you step back and begin to ask the unemotional questions that help us to discover the validity of our beliefs. But here's the trick. We gotta want to. And if our culture doesn't want us to, we develop very sophisticated ways to keep you from wanting to ask the questions. Notice that in this whole process, there's no mechanism for simply inserting truth. Truth is what we collectively decide to call it in too many areas of our lives. For religions, they only go so far in trying to assert rationale for their ideas. Eventually, as the rationale fails, they will seamlessly invoke faith to make their ideas unassailable. So it's up to each of us to do the hard work of challenging ideas both for ourselves as well as our communities. We must subject every idea to the scrutiny of reason and scientific inquiry. We must be willing to release every idea that fails that test. We must be willing to walk away from the collective when the rationale stumbles and falls with the invocation of faith. And we must be prepared to deal with the powerful emotions we will elicit as we insist that our future be based on sustainable proof. To do all of this, we must overcome the obstacles in our mind that hold us back. Each person in this audience holds ideas and beliefs in their mind. Some of you, as you reach adulthood, recognize your inherent right to mold those ideas into your own understanding of the world. You rejected any effort to control that freedom. But too many of us have embraced the collective claims of our own lack of worth. I spoke earlier of an epiphany I had following September 11th. It occurred to me in the emotional upheaval following that attack that the mechanism of faith could very well be one of the greatest threats to humans today. I made this statement in a speech I gave in Washington last March. It upset a lot of people. That they were so upset caused me to go back and think hard about what I had said. In the end, I still hold to that argument, because it's not an emotional argument. It's an idea based on sound reason and logic. If it is to be defeated, it must be defeated on its own merits, not on some emotional response to it. Let me try to explain it to you this way. A fundamental attribute of faith is that it cannot be challenged. So if I invoke faith as justification for belief, I am bound to allow that from all others. So by invoking faith for my beliefs, I now live in a world where I must accept a man's argument that it's okay to fly planes into buildings, since he builds that argument on faith. I have no right to challenge that idea. The thing that protects the people from dangerous ideas is the ability to challenge the idea with reason and logic. Faith takes that ability away. Accountability disappears and literally anything goes. Little Pakistani schoolgirls are shot for demanding an education. An Afghan woman gets her nose cut off for running from her abusive husband. And the leader of the Catholic Church in my home province denies the life-saving HPV vaccine to young women with the justification that he's a doctor of the soul. Faith lets people argue that if you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer, you're evil. Never mind what you do in your life. Never mind if you bring joy and comfort to others. Never mind if you act with kindness and generosity. Never mind whether you chose it. If you're a member of that community, you're judged evil and you can't defend against it. I'm advocating that we let go of hatred and prejudice and start treating people with justice. Let go of our biases, make our decisions about others based on their actions and not our unchallenged faith-based beliefs. I've heard prejudice defined as an attitude looking for evidence. When you consider the arguments my family paints on their signs, I think that definition is about perfect. God hates fags. My father calls that a profound biblical truth. Perhaps he's right. But instead of cowering, shouldn't we ask the question, what does that say about the Bible? Instead of blind obeisance to a book that promotes such ideas, why don't we challenge the validity of such a book? God hates fags. Let's consider that idea without paying undue deference to the holiness of the book from which it came. The real-world evidence I've seen strongly suggests that those who carry such signs don't speak for a supernatural deity, but rather for themselves. So I would change the first word of that sign from God to I. And what about hates? Again, it's not about a deity, but the person who carries the message. We have no evidence that certainly links a God to the harm that hate does. And hate's just a word that suggests a feeling. And it's not that you feel something, it's the actions that you take as a result of that feeling. So I would change the word hates to do harm. And finally, that emotion-laden term, fags, designed to piss people off and nothing more. But I see that word as just one in a long string of derogatory terms that humans have created that allow us to separate out, belittle, and dehumanize whichever group we decide to. Before fags, it was Jews, niggers, kikes, wops, women. Well, actually, women's kind of come back into vogue, hasn't it? My point is that fags is just another way of saying we're going to make this group less equal than us. And we're going to justify our actions by invoking faith, so we don't have to be held accountable. So when I see my family's trademark sign, God hates fags, I read this message. I do harm to those I judge less valuable than me. My family preaches a message of hatred. Their ideas tear down, insist that we abandon hope. The only proper response is to build up, restore love and hope. In my travels around the U.S. and Canada, I've met many truly remarkable men and women living in long-term happy relationships and raising loving children with their same-sex partner. Their lives contribute to the community, strengthening it and enriching it just as much as the lives of their neighbors. When they speak of their partner, the love and life they've shared, the insistent difference that society imposes fades away like a fog exposed to sunlight. But for too many, the shadow of exclusion, the pain of judgment, the practical inequities of this social ideology that we've inherited from religions continue to add bitterness to their lives. I have no doubt that people of goodwill take this issue seriously. And I have no doubt that America will eventually let go of another prejudice and equality will come for this group. But I also have no doubt that at this time, to paraphrase Dr. King, discrimination is a hellhound that continues to gnaw at the LGBT community in every waking moment of their lives, to remind them that the lie of their inferiority is accepted as truth in the society dominating them. Ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Let me challenge you with a new idea, a simple idea. Faith is not a virtue. It allows evil ideas to flourish unchecked. It is the justification for too much hatred. Let me close with this final thought. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell was interviewed late in his life. He was asked, what would you think are worth telling future generations about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it? His reply included these words: I should like to say two things, one intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say is this: when you're studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think would have a beneficent social effect if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That's the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say, I should say love is wise and hatred is foolish. Thank you very much.
So if anybody has any questions, here's your chance. Speak out for everyone, your 2 seconds. I think it's not this hand in the back row first.
My question is, Nate, do you think your father may have some form of mental illness?
Yes. I was talking to a reporter earlier today, and I had gone back to Topeka about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, to do a talk there. And there's an attorney there who's kind of been an outspoken critic of my father. I met with him, and he called me into his office, and he has a stack of about 4 cases of paper. In the early years of their campaign, my father was also sending out faxes, and he was sending them out daily, sometimes twice a day, and he had somehow he got fax numbers for people all over the country. And these faxes were his own drawings. He would draw caricatures, and he would slash words and ideas on it. And I spent probably 15 minutes going through that. And if all you ever knew about him, about that situation, were what you read on these, you would walk away thinking, there's something seriously wrong with this person. So I had that thought today, and I'm confident that there's something wrong. But he, like so many fundamentalist Christians do, rejects the idea of counseling. So we'll never know. Anyway. Any more? Yes, ma'am.
Why do you think your father is so fixated on you?
Well, I know that when we were growing up there, that he always, he argued, there was a passage in the New Testament that talks about God gave them up to their vile affections, and he construed that to mean that that was a special kind of sin that they were unable to recover from. So we just grew up with that belief that it was, that was the ultimate evil. I never really considered as a child growing up there that this might portend something, or point to some problem that he had, but he always believed it. It could simply be that he really believed that from a theological standpoint. Yes.
How does your father make money?
Well, he gets, he was practicing law until he got disbarred in the late 80s, I believe. But he's a pastor of that church, and he requires everybody to give 10% of their income. So he lives off of that. And then when they started this campaign, he just bumped that up to 30%. So that's how they fund their campaign, is everybody gives 30% of their income. And that's tax-free. So you get a lot more mileage out of it that way.
I have a question in regards to like the current trend in the world, in the United States specifically, going more and more anti-religious, especially in politics.
Yeah.
I know you're working at the Center of Inquiry in Canada. Do you guys have any research on that? And how much more religious we are today as a nation or the world is?
We don't have that much to do with the U.S. end of it. The anecdotal evidence suggests that we're much more religiously inclined, but we still maintain this kind of equilibrium. It seems like for like the last 4 or 5 presidential elections, it's been very tight. So it's hard to say whether it's just that it's more visible, become a bigger issue or not. But I do know that this fundamentalist, what they call dominionist theology, has grown in leaps and bounds up in Canada, and it's coming from America. There's a clear connection. A gal named Marcy McDonald wrote a book up there called The Armageddon Factor, I think it is, and she talks about how American religious groups are influencing and causing more of that up in Canada, and that the present administration up there is intimately tied to that whole theology. So there's some disturbing trends as far as fundamentalist religion in North America right now.
Like it roots with the U.S. It seems that it's also in the U.S. Unfortunately, a lot of the evangelical movements and missionary work, it's like all over the world. It's coming from the whole Bible Belt. They're just spreading missionaries all over the world.
Yeah.
It's like a scary trend in the world, actually, not just in the U.S.
Yeah. And then you have very similar trends with the Muslim, with Islam as well. So they're fighting for souls right now. Yes, sir.
I've been a big fan for a long time. I read your AMA, read it a little while ago, and I've read as you talk on Twitter. And my question was, occasionally you get into conversations with your family members.
Yeah.
Have you ever been in more of a prolonged conversation with them after you left, more than just tweeting back and forth?
No.
No.
No, what I've discovered is that once I let go of some of those fundamental assumptions, there's nothing to argue, because everything they believe is based on certain foundational assumptions that I have rejected. So what are we going to argue about? And quite frankly, I don't want to have anything to do with them, but every once in a while, like you said, one of them will pop off, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if they've had a conversation back there about me or what, but I'll say a few things back to them, and then they go off on this kind of intense staccato burst of raging against me, and so I just back away. Doesn't really solve anything, right? Yes?
Are you the only one of your 13 brothers and sisters to have left the group?
No, actually, the idea of leaving came because my older brother Mark left when I was 16, and prior to that, it just never occurred to me that that was an option. So he was my justification or my rationale for leaving. And then my younger sister Dorothy left several years later. So, and we all had a good relationship. I actually worked with Mark for about 25 years in the printing business in Southern California. So there's some family there. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that the church will be able to continue after your father's passed on?
That's a good question. I don't. When I first considered that, I thought that when he died, that it would die with him, because he's such that vitriol, that anger. The engine is the engine that drives that, right? and plus he is the absolute authority there. So what happens when that control mechanism goes away and that source of the rage? I mean, he's passed a lot of it on. I've kind of changed my thinking recently because a couple of my siblings, they look an awful lot like him now. And I don't know how much of that they've taken into their own core. But whatever happens, when he passes, it will look profoundly different. And could very well self-destruct because they don't have that cohesive force there anymore. Knock on wood. Yes?
This is actually kind of a follow-up question to that. A few years ago, Shirley Phelps did an interview on Fox News. She seems really adamant about the whole thing. You know, she's always on the front lines. She went to university and she got her law degree, and I think she goes as far as well. Do you think that she could be the spiritual successor to Fred Phelps? Do you think she could lead the church?
No, they won't allow her to. She's a woman. She's genetically tainted. No, they won't let her, but you're right, she's kind of been the leader of the group in the media. I've noticed it lately, they've been trying to put some male figures out there. My youngest brother, Tim, is, in my guesstimation, is the front runner. He's got a lot of my father's characteristics, that anger and hateful rhetoric that he can spew out. So maybe Tim. Yes, sir.
I got like two short questions. One of them, you mentioned at the Westboro Church, like they discriminate based on religion, obviously, and sexual orientation. Do they discriminate based on anything else, race or anything like that?
Within their own church? Well, I mean, my father grew up teaching us that like black race is cursed because of him. We talked about women. You know, other than that, generally it was their theology that got him in trouble. He hates the Catholic Church. He hates a lot of the mainstream evangelical leaders down here in the States. He used to rail a lot against, was it Schuer that runs the Crystal Cathedral in Southern California? He hates Billy Graham. Basically, he hates everybody. He's a equal opportunity hater. But it's all sound. You know, it's based on theology. Hates women because they cut their hair. Well, if you cut your hair and if you argue with a man, you're going to be in front of the line going to hell.
Then my other question was, apart from occasionally sniping at you over Twitter or in interviews or anything like that, has the group done anything else to attempt to interfere with you, just generally thinking like on buses, or are they mostly left alone?
Well, their public stance is that I'm irrelevant, but they spend a lot of time following me and responding to stuff. So I don't know if they're being consistent there. I was on the Rosie O'Donnell show back in March, and at the last minute, the legal department for the Rosie show said that we have to get a response from the Phelps family. So they gave them it was about a 20-minute video that she has on. I don't know if it's still there, but it was, of them sitting, like 7 or 8 of my siblings sitting and basically calling me a liar and trash talking me. That's probably about as formal as it's gotten, though. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Nate, with the goal of trying to figure out how your father got to be the way he is, do you know very much about his parents and how he was raised?
Basically, it was just the stories we heard growing up, which there weren't very many of them. He had cut off relations with his father and stepmother early when we were very young. Cut off ties with his sister. So, and then he forced my mother to cut off ties with any of her family. So we only knew what they told us. I have heard from a reporter who did an in-depth interviewing process with people all over the country. He went back to Mississippi where my father grew up. I know that his mother died when he was 5, and that's been suggested it could have been fairly traumatic for him. He grew up in a fairly mild religious environment. They were Methodist, but more social Methodist than anything else. He was very popular in school. He was a Golden Glove boxer, an Eagle Scout. He had an appointment to West Point. Those were the things we learned from him. But when they interviewed some of the neighbors there, that tendency towards kicking people in the knee and just to get them to respond apparently showed up fairly early in his life. You know, and they called him a bit eccentric even when he was younger. So, but that's a pretty sketchy outline of that. The only thing that technically explains it is when he was waiting, he graduated from high school, but he wasn't old enough to go into West Point, so he was waiting that summer. And him and his best friend went to a revival meeting at the local church, and they got saved. So he abandoned his plans for West Point and went to Bob Jones University instead. Started preaching. The rest, as they say, is history. Any more? Yes?
Are there still young children associated with the church? Is there any attempt to sort of rescue them, with your authorities to come in to rescue them?
Yeah, you know what? When they first started this in the early 90s, there was a lot of lawsuits. There was a lot of criminal and civil action going back and forth. And my family just wiped them up. They kept losing when the city would try to do something. And that has kind of been the story that I grew up with. It just got to the point where they didn't want to mess with them anymore. There's no political will. So there's a lot of discussion about putting those kids in harm's way by being in those pickets, but they won't touch that. So it's unfortunate. A lot of the kids have left, though. A lot of the young kids, once they hit their age of maturity, they left. Feel bad for them because they got a lot coming. Yes, sir.
I had read an article a few weeks ago actually about that a lot of their funding comes from lawsuits. And they have on people who maybe get a little aggressive at protests, maybe touch them, and they sue them for money and they send a lot of court. They're also pretty legally savvy. There's a lot of lawyers in the family.
Yeah, there are 11 of my siblings are lawyers. And I think that they're all still lawyers. The last thing I heard of was a couple of them got suspended for a while, but I think they all still have their degrees, and they are very savvy. There is some of that, but when you look at the numbers, it's a fraction of the money they spend. And they like to keep that idea out there because it serves to protect them. People don't want to take a chance of getting sued by them. But like when that,
Flag.
yeah, and that father, that case that ended up at the Supreme Court, Albert Schneider sued him. When the appellate court ruled in favor of my family, they also gave my family attorney's fees. So Schneider had to pay like $16 grand in attorney's fees. That got a lot of publicity. Bill O'Reilly got on this show and said that he would pay it himself. So they, in turn, put it out there that they were going to use this money. They deliberately said we're going to use this money to do more campaigning. So they fed that idea, but it isn't really funding that much of the effort, because I think they spend upwards of $300,000 a year, or they were. They've clearly slowed down recently. I think they're running out of money because too many people are leaving, or they have less money to work with. So, yes, sir.
I enjoyed your KKK, disavowing your family group, but are there any other groups out there that are on your radar that share the same kind of Christian hate model?
Well, there's that fellow Terry Jones in Florida. He's the only one I'm specifically aware of. There's a lot of groups out there, though. They're just not as well known. That Southern Poverty Law Center keeps that list of hate groups, which is controversial, but I think it would point you in the right direction for how many there are and how prolific it is as far as the membership of those groups. Yes, sir.
Did you ever notice any militaristic tendencies of your father?
No. And I actually talk about that at one point, so I have to be real careful how I say it anymore. When they start calling it a cult, that was upsetting to me because in my mind, no, that was just a church. You know, that's what I grew up with. It couldn't possibly be a cult. Sun Myung Moon is a cult. You know, the Jim Jones thing, the Guyana thing, that's a cult. My family wasn't a cult. So I started researching it, and the characteristics that define a cult, they all fit there. So by that description, they are a cult. And one of those characteristics is that charismatic, all-controlling leader. So I made the comment once in an interview that all it would take is for my father to decide that some violent act was called for in the Bible, and it would happen. The comment was designed to point out the kind of control he has, not necessarily their tendencies. Of course, the headlines were all about, you know, they could turn violent. So they haven't. I don't personally think they will. That doesn't mean that violence won't be visited on them at some point. And that's what concerns me, because they're kind of playing an end game right now. And you have to wonder if they don't start getting a little weirder as time runs out. So, yes, ma'am.
For a group of approximately 50 people, you know, give or take some, you seem to get a tremendous amount of media attention.
Yeah.
And I just was wondering what your thoughts on that, because I've heard criticism of the media sometimes for covering their protests. People say, oh, you're fueling the fire. You know, how do you think, what are your thoughts on how the media should handle, you know, their philosophy? You know, should they not cover it? You know, will it go away if we start ignoring them? You know?
Yeah. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I'm torn about that kind of logic. I think the media writes what they know that people will want to read. So what causes what, right? I think that the fact that they get as much attention as they do says a lot more about their behavior than some kind of special talent that they have. I mean, when you're that extreme, you know, that's just going to get a lot of attention. And they push the boundaries of everything we've ever really experienced. So that explains that, in my opinion. I really think the best response that we can have, because it's not going to go away and we're not going to be able to flip a switch and everybody ignore it. The best response is to use what they do, not against them, but to take that media interest, that visibility, and a lot of people are putting together campaigns where they collect money and then they donate it to some LGBT program within the community. They have mass counter protests where they block the grieving family, or you know, the protesters from the grieving families at funerals. So that kind of positive reaction that shows unity and support in the community is really, I think, the best way to respond to them. So, anyway, I guess that's it, eh? Thank you very much, folks. I'm sorry, Anna, I didn't hear that.
How do you feel if you're a child living in Baptist Church Tilbury? Will it interfere with your choice? If your children believe in...
How would I feel if they went into that? Oh God. The only thing I've had, one of my nephews tried to friend my oldest son on Facebook, and I didn't know what his motivation was at the time, and I freaked out. Because I kind of got to the point where I don't tell my kids what to believe, or, you know, I try to give them information and let them decide. And I just flat out told them, don't talk to them. So I would, it's kind of terrifying to think about them getting involved in that. Hopefully they won't. Anyway, thank you very much, folks.